I would like to start with a story of one voter from among the nearly 1,000 that my team at the Center for Civic Design has learned from over the last 5 or 6 years. This is Bill. When I met him, he struck me as somebody who had been through a lot, but it was kind of impossible to tell exactly how old he was. In my head, I was thinking that he was around 70. He came in to the room, he walked with a limp, and his left arm hung a bit differently from his right. The swing was different. He had on a snappy brown blazer, and he wore a big toothy smile. He was cheerful and he was flirty. This was in the fall of 2013. We were in a library in Berkeley, California, where my team was working on a study that we were doing about information about voting and elections that is published by California counties. I asked Bill what questions he had about the upcoming election. There was going to be a primary election in a couple of weeks. He said he didn't really know where to start. "I've been incarcerated, ma'am," he said. In my head, I'm going, this is not a big deal. He's here, I'm really glad. This is awesome. And I said to him, but you know that there's an election coming up, right? Like, the media was everywhere about this particular primary. He says, "Yes, ma'am." So I gave him the booklet that we were testing, a voter information guide, and I gave him instructions for how I wanted him to mark it up. And I asked him if he had any questions. "Are you ready to start?" He says, "Yes, ma'am, I'm ready, but I have a lot of trouble reading. I'm just learning now." So I said, "That's fine. We've got all morning." In fact, we did have all morning. "We can talk about anything you want. We can go through the booklet together. Whatever you like." But he's like, "No, I'm going to try this. Let's do it." So he started. And one of the first things that he encountered was this: the California Voter Bill of Rights. This was a revelation to him, especially the part that said that he could vote even though he'd been in prison. "Ma'am, is this document real?" he asked me. "Did I make this up for the test?" I said, "No, this is absolutely real. This is law in California." He says, "Is it true that I can vote even though I've been incarcerated?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "How do I get to do that?" "Well, you just register to vote. You can do it online here after we're done." He was amazed. He was super empowered. He was now energized to look through the whole booklet. We had a really fantastic session. I learned a ton. He struggled through most of the 24-page booklet. And we got incredible feedback. He was right, though. It did take a long time. When Bill finished and I'd asked all of my questions, he wanted to know how he could register to vote. My research partner was there from the League of Women Voters, and she had already pulled up the online voter registration website for California. And so she said, "Come on over here." And she got him started. In 2 minutes, he was registered to vote. He practically floated out of the room. So we administer our demographic questionnaires after our research sessions. So it wasn't until later that I learned that Bill was actually 56 years old, and he had spent 40 years in prison. But now, Bill could vote. So this is why I do this work, for people like Bill. So cool, we got him to register to vote. What happens after that? What's his experience likely to be like? To get a ballot in his hands and mark it and cast it. This is what my team looks at all the time. So some years ago, really about 2012, before we actually formed the Center for Civic Design, we started with a couple of big questions. And this launched us on looking at what is the journey that voters in the United States take, really? That question was, what questions do people actually have about elections? We know what the media says, we know what election administrators say, because they get calls into the call center, and media goes out into the street and interviews people. But there are questions that people don't tell those people about, it turns out. And we wanted to know what those were. We also wanted to know how they found out the answers to those questions. And that led us to ask a second question, which was, how well do local election websites actually answer those questions? So we did this in 2 phases. The first phase was we went out and looked at a lot of election websites. There are over 5,000 election jurisdictions in the United States. We could not look at all those websites. It turns out that about 1/3 of those jurisdictions don't even have websites. And our theory about that is that if the population of the county is 10,000 or fewer, you probably don't even need a website. So those places tend not to have one. So then it was, how are we going to narrow this down to have a decent sample without killing ourselves? We already had about 15 volunteers who were helping us do this. So we took a sample that looked at population density, high and low, racial and ethnic density, high, low, mix, and a couple of other factors, and we landed on about 145 sites, which then we looked at what are the words that are used in the links and the headings and the graphics. And we just plotted those out in simple Google spreadsheets in general proximity to where they appear on the page. So in the top, in the banner, on the left, in the middle, on the right, in the footer. Super simple. We thought that this would give us an indication of what election administrators thought was important. And it turns out that was a really good indicator. So that was the first thing that we did. And then the second thing we did was we recruited a whole bunch of people across the country. Our original list had about 100 people on it. We ran into some issues because of a little hurricane called Sandy, where everybody lost internet and lost power on the East Coast for a while. And we ended up doing remote moderated sessions where we asked people, first thing, what are your questions about the upcoming elections? Because there were primaries. By now, we're up to November 2012, and we're asking in September and October. So, first question, I will reveal in a moment, but it was very, very consistent across our participants, and we've heard this over and over again since then. And then we asked people to go try to find the answers to their questions on their local election websites. So, what we saw is this is how election administrators think. There's basically this 10-step process. It is largely chronological based on their deadlines, and there are a lot of deadlines that make it really challenging to put on a good election that gives a good voter experience. So they really think that the process starts with registering to vote, mainly because this is the first set of deadlines that they have to launch, open and close. And then goes from there, announcing polling places, opening up polling places, making sure that the ballots are ready, getting those in place, etc. And so this is the institutional process. And this is how election officials think about this. But when we asked voters, when we asked them what questions they had about upcoming elections, this is what we heard. What's on the ballot? Now, if you remember that timeline, this is pretty far into the process, skipping a whole bunch of steps. But this is the driver for everything that happens inside a voter's life. So this finding was a really big deal. It rocked the world of election administration. Yes, there's a world of election administration. And when we went out talking about this, about the questions that voters have and how well or how badly the local election websites were doing in answering those questions, these really nice people, town clerks and county clerks who put on elections, were really shocked at how poorly their departments were performing for their voters. Because most of them really want to do a good job. But now they knew why they were experiencing some of the pain that they were feeling, at the call center and in the polling places. Now it turns out, as I said, that this is not exclusive to websites. As we tested lots of other pieces of information, print and online, in voter guides and voter information and voter education, same thing. People are like, what's on the ballot? What am I voting for? And we think that what this really means is people are assessing whether there's something that's so important that they're willing to invest their time and effort in the process. And this becomes really important as you look across the experience. This is important because voting in elections in the United States is way different from any place else in the world. And if you came here from Maine, for example, you just had a primary where you voted in a way that very few jurisdictions in the United States do using ranked choice voting. I want to give you a couple of examples of what voting is like in other places. So this is the ballot for Brexit. It asks 2 questions. Stay or leave. Much debate about the wording of the question, but still, this is it. This is the only question. This is from the Catalonia independence referendum last year. Yes or no? Even this is from a UK election in 2017, about a year ago actually, where you are selecting a party, the party that you want to lead your government. You're not voting for a whole bunch of different offices. You're not voting for individuals. And then Sweden has elections coming up in September, and so the yellow are ballots for the parliament, the white ones are for municipal elections, and the blue ones are for county council elections. So you just pick the one you want and you drop it into the box. Super simple. But here we are. This is a look at how things work in the US. Now, this is an example from 2016. Everybody in the world was pretty aware that there was a presidential election in the United States, but in San Francisco, California, where this example comes from, there were also elections for US Senator, Congressperson, State Senator, State Assembly Person, a judge, Board of Elections, Board of Education, College Board, Director of the Bay Area Rapid Transit, and boards of supervisors positions by district, half of them. But there's more. There were also more than 40 questions on the ballot. And this is just a checklist. This is not the actual ballot. This is what ballots actually look like. This is a typical ballot design for a system where you fill in a bubble and then you push the paper through a tallying machine that scans the bubbles. This one from San Luis Obispo, this is relatively short, but this can be between 11 and 19 inches long. I think the maximum that this system can process is 19 inches long. Some jurisdictions in California where they just had a primary had 4 maximum length ballot cards to vote on both sides of contests. So there are a lot of really interesting design elements. There are a lot of stakeholders. There are tons of constraints. And we just love this beautiful kind of wicked problem. And we've been working on this for a while. So I tell you that by way of giving one example of what makes elections in the United States different from any place else in the world. When you take all that stuff together, voters' needs and their contexts and what their questions are, how they try to answer them, what their challenges are in getting to the polling place and getting a ballot in their hands, what they're willing to invest in their own time and energy, a measure of what their commitment is, and how they feel about it. How hard could it be to fix this? Like government generally, we could just run it like a business. That would be good. So learning that voters are ballot-centric, this is a really important finding, and that most people, for most people, all of the decisions about whether to take part really start there. This is a big deal. So my team mapped this out, and here's what that looks like. Across the top, this is the institutional process. This is the one that election officials and geeky people like me generally think of as the process. And if you're a political junkie, you probably do too. Below that, I'm going to show you the voter's actual path. So, as I said, across all of our research, the most common question that people start with is, what's on the ballot? Way down there. Great. So our privileged voter, this is the first path I'm going to show you, but our privileged voter is like, awesome, I'm ready to go, I am tuned in, I know what I need to know, I am in for this. Now, what are my options for taking part? The privileged voter gets a voter guide mailed to him. He can, this includes a sample ballot or his real ballot, like in Washington, Oregon, and Colorado. And he can mark it and drop it in a mailbox or take it to a drop box or take it to a polling place. But our dude actually loves voting in the polling place, and he's been voting in the same polling place for decades. This hasn't changed. It's close to his house. It's easy to find. He basically zooms through steps 2 and 3. Now, how do you mark the ballot? Now, for better or for worse, his voting system has been exactly the same for the last 15 years, and he's an avid voter, so he's had plenty of practice, and it turns out that there are many more elections than you realize, so he does practice quite a bit. He feels very confident that he knows how to mark his ballot, and his voter guide reminded him of what to do and how to do it. There are actually illustrated instructions in it. This is incredibly rare. You'd be surprised. Now, where he lives, he does not need a voter ID. So that's a hurdle averted. He's engaged in his community and he knows his local representatives. So he knows who's in office already and what their record is. Now, it's typically about here that voters start to wonder what their voter registration status is and whether it's up to date. So our privileged voter comes back to the beginning of the institutional process. But he lives in a place where there's automatic voter registration. So even if he'd moved sometime in the last couple of years and changed his address on his driver's license, the state would have just automatically updated his voter registration. Like the 21st century. Now, because he got his ballot in the mail with his voter guide, he's already marked his ballot, or he's made himself a checklist that he can take with him to the polling place, and he can cast his ballot and go home and go to his local election website and check the results. That's amazing. This is about as frictionless as it gets, but this is not the experience that most voters have. If you are having this experience, congratulations. 90% of voters in the US do not. Most voters in the US experience voting as a test. Now, it's probably not an accident that that feeling comes through, especially if you're filling out bubbles like you did on standardized tests when you were in school. But in addition to that, there's a lot to know and a lot to do to understand what the issues are and who's running, and just to get through the gauntlet of getting a ballot in your hands. So some of the steps, we should note, are actually very well intentioned. You want to make sure that only the people who are actually eligible are getting a ballot and marking it and casting it. No question about that. But giving lots of options for taking part, what Govy nerds call convenience voting, for things like having early voting and having vote centers and things like that, this actually gives people more decisions to have to make and more homework to have to do as you try to figure out, when does early voting start? Where can I go to do that? What are the hours? Are they open on weekends? So while it sounds like a really great idea, it is actually burdening the voter with more decisions to make. So what I'm about to show you is much closer to how most people experience voting in the US. And if you're a designer in a large organization, whether that's government or in the private sector, you may recognize bits of this that we do to people without thinking about it. So if you work for a bank or an insurance company, for example, or a biotech company, think about, are you doing any of these things to your customers? So here's the path of the burden voter. Same 10 steps, same institutional path at the top, just for comparison. And our burden voter starts in the same place as the privileged voter. He has the same question. What's on the ballot? What's so important that I really want to take part in this? Is there something that is so important that it's going to change my life or affect the lives of people around me? But our burdened voter doesn't get a voter guide. He doesn't get a sample ballot in the mail. Now, a voter guide would explain in plain language what's on the ballot, what the issues are, et cetera. And it would include information about everything that's going to be on the ballot, the candidates and the questions, along with how to actually carry out your franchise. That would actually be helpful. But it turns out that only about 9% of the 5,000-ish jurisdictions out there actually send this information directly to voters. So that's a burden, that's an obstacle, and it turns out that it's not that easy to find trustworthy information online either. So even if he wants to, it's a lot of work. Now, deciding how to take part is tough because there's no really good information coming to him. It's not published on the election website in a timely way or any place else. And he learns that he's missed the window. He just moved into the town where he lives, and he's never voted at his polling place before, and it's far away from where he lives. Actually, it's far away from where he works, but it's close to where he lives, and those two things are very far apart, so planning to get there is complicated. And I can't scroll my notes, sorry. Do this again. What's on the ballot, how to take part, find a polling place, right. Now, he finds his polling place. It's not well signed, but he's feeling okay about it. Now, next thing is where he lives now is a place that he needs voter ID, which he has, which is great. But, oh man, the process for getting that was not easy, cheap, or pleasant. Getting to the DMV was not cheap or fast. Spending time, on average about 3 hours at the DMV waiting for his ID, was also not cheap because he ended up having to take time off to do that too. And even though a voter ID in all the states by law must be free, he has lost wages, he has money that he spent on transit and or parking. He had to get a birth certificate, which in some counties will cost $25 to get your own birth certificate. It adds up pretty fast. And if you live in Texas, the nearest DMV, on average, is 25 miles away. So that was a lot of work, and he's kind of proud of himself for getting this together. Now, note that we are just now getting to step 5, back to voter registration. Right? He had registered to vote, but when he moved house, he's now in a new county, which means his voting jurisdictions have all changed, and he has to update his voter registration with his new address. And where he lives, he has to do it, bless you, he has to do it on paper. So he goes to the website, he downloads a PDF, which is not fillable online. He has to print it out, fill it out by hand, provide a wet signature that is actually his official signature that will be matched at some point in the process to make sure that he is who he says he is. Put it in an envelope, put a stamp on it, mail it in, and get it there in time for the voter registration deadline. You can see how that might turn out. Now, he does all that, and because burdened voters, people who are burdened generally, are short on time, this is their number one lack of resources, time. He hasn't had any time to do homework about what the questions are and who the candidates are. And because it's hard, because finding reliable information is not that easy, he doesn't know who's already in office. He doesn't know what's going to be on the ballot exactly. So when he shows up in the polling place, on election day, he is just overwhelmed with all of the stuff on the ballot and all the decisions that he has to make, and it takes forever. So he gets there, he's super confused about how to mark the ballot because it's the death of 1,000 design cuts. He leaves hoping that he got everything right, and he's interested in knowing the results, but they're not posted on the local website. And I don't know, maybe you get the local newspaper, but a lot of people don't get the local newspaper. And it takes a week for those to be posted in the local newspaper. So that is what it looks like for most people in the US. So we have to ask ourselves, in the spirit of making things easy, are we actually making things hard? Like I said, take the example of early voting. You have to learn about what all the options are, what all the dates and times are, what all the places are. This is actually behavioral economics playing out at every step, right? People are making rational decisions about whether to stay in or whether to leave based on how much they have gone through already and what they have to face next. This is, by the way, what is happening in everything that we design. This is not unique to the election system in the United States. People are always asking, should I stay in and move on, or should I drop out and do something else? Now, for elections, if you add to this the buzz of the information ecosystem, especially in an electoral system where presidential campaigns go on for a couple of years, the whole thing can be overwhelming and exhausting for a lot of people. So I give you this as context, because there's this notion that people who don't vote don't care and that they are apathetic. But a thing that we have come to realize is that we don't actually think that there's a thing in voter apathy. We think that Americans really do care about voting. Almost all of them, like 99% of people actually really care about voting. But for some, it's harder. For some, the trade-offs at each step mean dealing with the problems in the now at the expense of weighing what might happen in the future, which is very hard to imagine. So we think that there actually is no such thing as voter apathy. We think that the system is designed in such a way that it actually forces people out of it. Now, we never ask this question, are there people out in the world who don't care about voting? That's not where we're at. My team looks at UX in the government space. We asked, what obstacles do people face in casting a vote the way they intend? And what we learned is that people try really, really, really hard to vote, and they feel shame when they don't vote. And one of the pieces of evidence that we have for that is that the Census Bureau every 2 years does a community survey where they ask whether you voted, whether you registered, and whether you voted in the last election. And that number is consistently 10% higher than the actual vote count collated from all of the jurisdictions. So what we did see, what we do continue to see, is that in trying to make things more convenient and easier for voters, we've actually made it harder because there are more decisions to make, like I said. This kind of thing is true across government. And in my experience, this is true whether you are applying for food assistance or buying health insurance or paying your taxes or just trying to get a business license. And as a user, there are actually more steps than anybody inside the institution, whatever that institution is, typically realize. So as a product team or as a team delivering a service, there are also many more steps than you really realize too. So how the organization thinks about the process and the activities is way different. We're talking about mental models here, right? Election officials, one mental model. Voters, different mental model. Probably media, different mental model. Designers, we all probably have our own mental model of this too. But getting those, closing the gaps among those, that's where we're at. Now, my team could not possibly have laid out a research plan ahead of time that would lead us here. The map that we made, this is an artifact. It is not the product. There was not our plan or our idea to make a visual representation of this. We did it partly because I committed to a conference and then got accepted. But we did it more because it is a tool for us to know, to gauge ongoing what we feel like we know. Where is the evidence thin? Where is it deep? What questions keep coming up for us? So we use this artifact to track where we are in our understanding of this particular problem space. So we did the research to begin to understand the problem. So our research agenda actually looks a bit different. Not only did we hear about 1,000 stories in those 5 or 6 years, it took a lot of people to collect those stories. After all, design is a team sport, and we try to involve as many folks as we can. The first study that we did, the one that I talked about at the beginning, needed 30 researchers and 40 participants. The next one took about 100 interviews that my colleague, Whitney Quisenberry, who is my co-director at the Center for Civic Design, and I did literally on the street interviews and usability tests. That was fun. And the next one gave us more than 35 voters with low literacy. I'm going to talk about that some more as we go on. Then we worked with hundreds of poll workers and their bosses across the country to sort of round out the picture of what the experience was like. In 2016, my team tested messaging, like text messaging and email subject lines and things like that with about 40 participants, and did a diary study with 50 participants. That was amazing. And then they worked with a couple of dozen election officials to implement, to pilot some of the things that we had all learned together. So we didn't do this alone. We couldn't possibly do this alone. We had a lot of partners, a bunch of volunteers, a few grad students, basically a lot of help, and we used a lot of different methods to get to what we feel like we know. Because it turns out that problems like this, hard problems, they're hard. And this is why I love working in civic design, because there's just an endless supply of problems to work on. Now, in UX generally, I believe the design is getting harder and more nuanced as every one of us has to think not only of the UI of a digital experience, a phrase that I really don't like, but the culture and context that it's being used in, the security and the privacy parameters and perimeters, and the business and political constraints. I think a discussion that we should be having right now and ongoing is what are the second and third order effects from the things that we are making? Because every single design decision you make makes a difference in what the ripple effects are. So we had that first question. What questions do voters actually have about elections? And you know that if you do research, and probably all of you have your fingers in research at some level, finding answers to one question just reveals more questions. And so that is really what has happened here over time. You peel away the relatively easy problems, you reveal subtler issues and harder problems and deeper complexities. And so we did all that, and we came away with a few insights. Excuse me. All of these insights come through a lens of civic engagement, generally, not just about voting. So go with me here. First, people want to know what's actually happening in the election and how it will affect their lives. They want to know whether it's an activity that they should be investing in, and what will be different, what actually the outcomes will be because this happened. This person got elected, or this question was passed or not. People want to vote, but if they can't relate to what the outcomes are going to be for their own daily lives and the lives of people who are important to them, this is a key thing, they're not going to vote. And if they don't know what to do, if there are mysterious parts of this process, they're not going to show up. People who are new to a process don't even know where to start asking questions. This feels like an exclusive club that they are not part of, and that they'll have to take a test to get in. It may not be a literacy test, but it basically comes down to, are you inside this club or are you outside this club? Do you know the secret handshake already? Think about, in the private sector, somebody learning to invest in the stock market for the first time, or somebody who has just been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. They have to become an instant expert. It's the same scale of problem. People drop out because every obstacle is cumulative. I think this is really important. I think we forget this as we're doing design generally. We think that if we can get people, and you see this in usability testing, right? If you can get people through one part of the task or one step in a larger task, yay, awesome. maybe people will be energized to get to the next thing, but that's not how it works. How it actually works is, this one was hard, I carry that burden with me into the next task. The second one was hard, I carry both of those with me into the next task. It is cumulative. That frustration goes all the way through, even if the experience is delightful. So it's exhausting, and the burden is great. This is a big deal, and you need to pay attention to this. In the US, nearly half of all adults read at or below the 6th grade level. I'll let that sink in. So, there are people, I know, it might be hard to read. Thanks for that, Chris. There are assessments for this that are very good, that I really recommend that you include in your work. There are good ways of doing it, and if you're curious about that, we can talk about that. I'm going to be here all day. So Winnie and I have been working in plain language for a really long time. We're old. So like decades. And we considered ourselves experts at plain language. And we got a project a few years ago that ended up being called the Anywhere Ballot. Really what we were doing was creating a digital ballot marking device, UI, that would run in any standard compliant browser. So think about the possibility of marking a ballot on your phone, for example. And because this was part of an accessible voting technology initiative, our project had to have an accessibility component to it. Now, we already knew a lot. Everybody knows a lot. I think everybody in this room knows a lot about how to design for people who are blind or who have low vision. You probably know some pretty good stuff about designing for people with mobility and dexterity problems. And you could probably do a respectable job of combining those and delivering a pretty respectable experience for those folks. But it turns out there are hundreds of thousands of people in the country and across the world who have invisible disabilities. Low literacy is one of those. You could grow up not being able to read well and never know that other people don't encounter the same kinds of issues as you. You might be dyslexic. You might have a combination of low vision and dyslexia. That would suck. But also, there are lots of people who have served in our military who come back with PTSD and brain trauma and all kinds of things that you can't see. And they may not acknowledge or identify with, and probably aren't diagnosed. So when we were working on the Anywhere Ballot, all of our participants were people with low literacy. And while we had made the headings and the instructions super plain language because we're experts, it took like 3 participants to kick our asses before we just started rewriting everything and taking text out. It was one of the best things that's ever happened to me in my career, and I really recommend that no matter what sector you work in, you seek out people who have low literacy and low English proficiency, because you will learn so much from them about how your stuff works. We learned that voters were frustrated in their attempts to separate signal from noise. And in the 2016 election, this was harder than ever. Now, a year and a half later, you have all heard all of the things about Russian bots and infiltration and lots of different levels. But as we were doing this diary study leading up to the presidential, which, by the way, all 50 participants that we recruited stayed in, that was weird, we kept hearing from people, there's too much. I can't figure out what's real and what's not. I can't figure out what's helpful and what's authoritative and what's fake. And this led some people to shut down. We saw it like a canary in the coal mine. So if users can't tell what's important, if they can't understand the messages that they're getting, they're going to just opt out. They'll stop trusting the information they're getting, but they also stop trusting the larger system, however you define system. This is not good for a democracy because it's going to exhaust their willingness to invest in the greater good because they're in survival mode themselves. They're going to trade off what they can control now and immediately to feel okay for a future that they can't predict. So, we're all responsible for this. Information has to be usable and useful and accessible and clear and plain and relatable. So taken together, all of those things tell quite a story. All along the way, all those stories from voters, we heard just how hard it is for people to vote. There are dozens of hurdles. One of the things we learned is that there's still a lot that we don't know. Like, this is a list of just the kinds of things that we do know. There are others for people who are in the military and who are citizens who are living abroad. There are more for people who live in underserved districts. Like, maybe there's not much in the way of bandwidth and connectivity there. Maybe the roads are just terrible. Maybe the schools are terrible. There are more for people who have limited English proficiency. So now we have a research agenda for the next 10 years. But this is what we feel like we know. People want to know whether the activity is worth their investment in time and energy. They worry that they don't know enough to make a good decision. The burden adds up across the experience, and it's difficult to connect the promises with real life. So, if you want to change how elections and voting work for people, here are some steps that you can take. If you want to change how government works, we can talk some more. First thing you can do is you can register to vote. You can do it online in Vermont, so do it. If you think that you are registered, you want to double check your voter registration status because changes get made to systems all the time and people drop off the rolls for unexplained reasons. So it's a very good idea to just periodically check, even if you haven't moved or whatever. It is not true that once you register, you are registered forever, independent of your voting behavior. So if you were paying attention to a decision that came out of the Supreme Court this week that was from Ohio, Ohio's practice is to drop you from the voter rolls if you haven't voted in 2 general elections. That means 2 November elections. The law allows them to do this, but it's not standard practice because it's kind of aggressive. So I don't know what the rules are in New Hampshire and Vermont, but can't hurt for you to go online and go check. It takes 30 seconds. Next, sign up to be a poll worker. This is one of the best experiences you will ever have in your life doing field research. It's fascinating. It's a long day that pays very little money, but this probably sounds exactly like your regular job. You'll learn a ton about how humans behave and how they treat one another. And it gives you some really interesting insights to how government works, like from the ground up, all of the paperwork, etc. I really recommend that you go do that. It's one of the best experiences you'll ever have. If you can't break away to do the few hours of training and the 14, 16-hour day that working the polls takes, go to your town clerk and ask them if you can just be an observer. They may say, that's weird that you're not doing this as part of a party, because the political parties typically sign up to register to be official observers because they they're counting people who came through as kind of an audit to make sure that the counts that come from the town are accurate. But you can persuade them that you are just doing research and that you want to learn about how these things work, and they will typically let you do that. Also a super interesting experience. Deep hanging out. A thing that we hear more and more about is people in neighborhoods actually helping one another. This is kind of an old-fashioned idea that is reviving, and it's really fun. So one way that we've heard this happens is over a couple of, like through a supper club. People will get together in their neighborhood and have dinner and look at what's on the ballot and who's running for what contests, and basically make assignments. Somebody, volunteers to look at the candidates for governor or for mayor or whatever, and to investigate the questions or the measures that are on the ballot. And then you come back a week later and people report out their nonpartisan homework and what they've learned, so that everybody shares the information, but everybody also shares the burden. So this can be a really interesting civic exercise that will help you also know your neighbors. Finally, a thing that we know, there's a lot of research and data that support this, is if you have a plan to vote, you are much more likely to get to the polls and cast your ballot. So make a plan for yourself for the next election and help somebody else make a plan. It's really that simple. Get a voting buddy. Related, we know, at least anecdotally, that people who had a childhood experience of being taken to the polls by a grown-up are more likely to be civically engaged generally and to vote. Now, if you don't have kids, rent one. Just kidding. But, nieces and nephews could also use this experience. If you do have kids, take them with you. They are allowed in the polling place. The rules vary about what they're allowed to do. In the old days, when there were lever machines, it was common for people to bring their kids in and then let them throw the lever to actually cast the ballot. We don't have that physical act anymore, but there are equivalents. So take your kids with you. So I leave you with those ideas. If you want to change how the system works, how government works, how the company you work for works, show up, be present. Decisions get made by the people who show up. And finally, I leave you with this, which I tweet almost every day because it seems like it needs to do that. Find the truth and tell the truth. Thank you. Keep up the good work.